Period four, which is really everything from the turn of the 19th century up to the beginnings of the American Civil War, is going to start off by looking at a series of economic changes called the market revolution that's going to reshape not only the American economy, but its landscape, its culture, and its politics. So the market revolution is not, well, rather the things you want to pull from it are not purely economic things, but looking at the effects that it has cascading across the rest of American society. Number one is asking what were the main elements of the market revolution? So the first is the so-called transportation revolution. And along with that, we have a kind of communication revolution. So first of all, in terms of transportation, we see state and local governments as well as private companies investing in building roads. They don't, or excuse me, they are not typically what we would envision as, say, interstates, but rather locally paved roads rather than dirt paths or gravel paths or something like that. Now, Congress did charter the so-called National Road in 1806 to go through the Cumberland Gap to help settle the Old Northwest. But in terms of national infrastructure, there's not a whole lot. The transportation is really done mostly by the states. Next, we had the invention of the steam engine and thus the steamship. This is important because it allows for upstream transport, which is going to speed up commerce in the United States, because at this time, waterways are still the chief avenue of transportation of goods and people. To that end, we see the beginnings of a canal building craze across the country. And it will begin with the success of the Erie Canal, which was a canal dug by New York State to connect New York to the Great Lakes region, thus connecting really the Atlantic to the Great Lakes. It's going to be very successful. And like I say, it's going to inspire other local and state governments across the country to invest in building canals. Again, waterways are still the best means of travel for commerce and people. Eventually, railroads are going to overtake canals as the main avenue of transportation. There's going to be more construction of railroads in the north and in the Midwest than there is going to be in the South. The South invests very little in this kind of infrastructure. Their capital is tied up in land and in slaves. And luckily, the lack of railroads will help contribute to their loss in the Civil War later on. Before moving on, though, I want to note that there are not many railroads in this 1800 to 1840 period, but around the time of the Civil War and certainly after the Civil War in the late 1800s, there will be an enormous explosion of railroad building across the country. I said that along with the transportation revolution, we also have a communication revolution. And much of that has to do with Samuel Morse's invention of the telegraph, which allows near instantaneous communication across vast distances using his eponymous Morse code. Altogether, advancements in transportation and in communication help to facilitate not only greater commerce, but also greater westward migration, and thus the acquisition of new territory. Um, it's in this period, actually 1819, that we see the United States finally purchase Florida, which had long been a goal of Southern slavers. So Florida will be purchased from Spain via the so-called Adams-Onis Treaty, again in 1819. A huge part of the market revolution and really the American economy for the foreseeable future is going to be the establishment of the so-called Cotton Kingdom in the South. So the industrial North, as well as other trading partners that have begun to industrialize, like Britain, there is a high demand for cotton to produce textiles. But American short staple cotton had been very labor intensive to cultivate and thus had not been very profitable, despite the fact that the southern climate was ideal for growing this cash crop. It's going to be Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin that will change all of that. It will make cotton easier to cultivate and thus less labor intensive in the sense of picking out seeds and other things from the cotton fluff. And it's going to become very profitable. And the South will begin to fill the immense demand for cotton in northern mills as well as mills across the world to make textiles. Unfortunately, the establishment of the Cotton Kingdom will mean that slavery is going to expand right alongside the expansion of cotton production. We'll see massive migration into what we call the Old Southwest, essentially what are now the states of Alabama and Mississippi, as they look for new soil. This rich, nutrient-rich soil in Alabama and Mississippi is referred to as the black belt, the color, think potting soil kind of thing. And it's important to note that cotton is going to lead to an enormous demand for new land because you can only cultivate cotton on land for about 3 years before it has sucked up all the nutrients in that soil and becomes unfarmable for a while. So in order to keep cotton production going and even expand it, they're going to have to constantly acquire new land. And that's going to have some ripple effects, to say the least, across the next couple of decades. So cotton will become king, and King Cotton will become America's largest export. In fact, as you can see here, by 1860, which is the outbreak of the Civil War, cotton exports will account for more than all other exports combined. It is central to the southern economy, but it is also central to the northern economy because northern mills are taking this raw material of cotton and manufacturing it into textiles and then selling it overseas, selling it back to the South. Also, northern bankers are getting rich off of loaning money to Southerners to buy new land or to buy new slaves. Likewise, they are insuring that land and slaves, which after all were defined as property. So to say that cotton is king in the South would be too limiting. Cotton is king in the American economy, and everything relies on it from this point on. Number two, how did the market revolution spark social change? So one, we're going to see commercial farming emerge in the Old Northwest. So what that means is that you're growing only one crop for sale in a cash market. This is going to be made possible by new inventions like John Deere's steel plow, Cyrus McCormick's horse-drawn reaper that you see here. But what that means is that the Old Northwest is going to become less the small farmer agrarian republic Jeffersonian idea and more like bigger companies or wealthier individuals that are harvesting enormous fields of wheat or corn for sale in a cash market. We'll also see the growth of cities as centers of commerce and trade, particularly those that are along waterways. Cincinnati and Louisville are good examples of that as they become major trading hubs. And you'll probably know, or at least have some idea from Kentucky history, that about the late 1800s, by the time railroads replaced canals and waterways, Louisville ceases to be a major American city. Next, and very importantly, is the growth of industry. So during this period, we see industry grow during the Embargo Act and the War of 1812, because we need to manufacture our own goods because we're not really getting along with our trading partners. Most of this manufacturing is textiles at first, but then it'll expand to produce other products. And our example that's really valuable to use is Lowell, Massachusetts. Lowell, Massachusetts is a mill town. It's an entire town that's built around textile mills. It's going to serve as a model for the rest of American industry moving forward, everything from the manufacturing techniques and the machinery into the organization, all the way to who is working these factories. And it's overwhelmingly at first going to be a workforce of women, young single women, and children. The American system of manufacture is also going to rely on interchangeable parts. This is Eli Whitney again. It's the idea that parts should be standardized and so that they're all the same size so that anybody can put something together, not a, you don't need a skilled craftsman. I don't want to overemphasize that, but it's like our one contribution to the early industrial revolution. Work in these factories or mills is going to be governed by the clock, and that strictly separated people's time between work and leisure, and wages will be paid on an hourly basis. And this is an enormous change for most Americans' lives. Most kind of blended their leisure time and their work time throughout the day, going back and forth between them as jobs needed to be done. But when you're being paid by the hour and you have to clock in and out, your time is much more strictly regulated. And it's going to introduce this basic division that we're used to today of I work during these hours and I am off during these hours. Again, most early factory work was done by women and children. This is a standard set in Lowell, Massachusetts. And our example here are so-called Lowell girls, a good example to have in your pocket when it comes to women's history questions. But Lowell girls were young, unmarried women who served as the initial labor force for the Lowell Mill in Massachusetts. But again, other mill towns that pop up across the country will model themselves after Lowell and employ a similar kind of workforce for right now. Now, demand, or rather increased demand for industrial production, led to increased immigration into the United States. And between 1840 and 1860, over 4 million immigrants arrive in the US. Most of these are German and Irish. The largest group was the Irish. They were fleeing the potato famine in Ireland. They were typically poor, which is why they settled on the East Coast, places like New York and Boston, because they're able to afford their passage over, and that's about it. And they can't move further inland. They simply don't have the money, generally speaking. So they would work in coastal cities as low-paid manual laborers. They helped to build canals, later on railroads. And because they were willing to work for lower wages, they would begin to replace women in factories such as Lowell. The second largest group were Germans, and they is a little bit more complex, but they were generally speaking fleeing political and economic conditions in Europe. They tended to have more money when they arrived, so thus more able to move further west. And that's why we see a lot of tight-knit kind of ethnic enclaves or small Midwestern towns where some German culture is preserved there. With this new immigration, we will see the beginnings of a great American tradition, which is being anti-immigrant. So immigration alarmed many nativists or native-born Americans who were opposed to immigration. And these nativists feared the impact on America's political and social life of the Irish and Germans coming in, especially the Irish, who were Catholic, as were some of the Germans. But as always, immigrants are accused of taking jobs from Americans for working because they'll work for lower wages. Um, there is fear that they don't understand American political institutions and won't be able to operate properly in them. And also because many of them, again, were Catholic, there was fear that they would do the bidding of the Catholic Church in Rome. And most Americans still associated their Americanness directly with their Protestant identity. So anti-Catholic sentiment is very much alive and well here. The Irish will be subject to discrimination, facing signs like NINA, which stands for No Irish Need Apply, as well as stereotypes, oftentimes similar to stereotypes and depictions for African Americans, oftentimes depicting them as lazy, shiftless, and even ape-like, as you can see here. Finally, in terms of social change, the law was increasingly interpreted to help business, which is going to help the economy grow over the long term. A good example here is an 1824 case decided by the Marshall Court called Gibbons v. Ogden, and it struck down a state steamboat monopoly and said that only the national government can regulate interstate trade and commerce. So New York cannot set a monopoly for a steamship company in this case to travel between New York and New Jersey because that crosses state lines and that is completely the purview of the national government. And reinforcing that division of power, reinforcing the national government's ability to regulate interstate trade and commerce is going to allow for freer operation of businesses, which means greater growth over time. Number three, how do the meanings of American freedom change during this period? A huge change is the introduction of the idea of manifest destiny. Now, that term isn't going to be coined until 1845 when a newspaper editor named John O'Sullivan gives it a name, but the idea is already emerging in the early 1800s prior to that point. So manifest destiny suggested that the United States had a kind of God-given right or God-given destiny to expand from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And in doing so, you have these racist undertones where it is assumed that this is the right thing to do because in expanding westward, Americans would bring the benefits of white civilization to non-white people living in the West, like Native Americans or Mexicans, because after all, Mexico controlled much of the American Southwest at this time. This is really important. Manifest Destiny is going to prove very influential for future expansion and even wars that we'll see in the early 1800s. Next, we have the emergence of the genre, I guess, or art form, transcendentalism. It's a philosophical and literary movement that emphasized living a simple life and celebrating the truth that is found in nature. It stresses the freedom of individualism, and it's meant to be a kind of response against the increasingly mechanized world of the industrial city and the industrial north, and working as part of a workforce, kind of like a drone in a larger system, and emphasizing that the individual, emphasizing nature. The best known transcendentalist authors are Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, depicted here. They might be good examples to have, especially Thoreau. We'll come back to him later on. Finally, we're going to have the so-called Second Great Awakening during the early 1800s, and it's very similar to the First Great Awakening during the colonial period. Again, it's a religious revival movement in the 1820s and 30s. It's led by a guy named Charles G. Finney, and it helps to democratize Christianity and make it more central to American culture. And again, we'll see this huge proliferation of new Protestant denominations in response to this Second Great Awakening. Importantly, it will stress the right of private individual judgment in spiritual matters and personal choices that can help you achieve salvation. Right? So this frees you a bit from the hierarchy of the clergy of your religion and stresses that you as an individual can save your soul and you don't necessarily need a church to do it for you. It's also really notable that the Second Great Awakening completed the conversion of most slaves to Christianity. This had started to an extent during the First Great Awakening in the colonial era, but it's going to reach its zenith in this period. And we see a lot of traditional African spiritual traditions that have been blended in and modified over time begin to fade out and be replaced by a more Americanized form of Christianity. Number four, how did the market revolution affect the lives of workers, women, and African Americans? So first, workers. Quickly, there was a widening gap between wealthy merchants or industrialists and the poor workers that they employed. There were some early, albeit unsuccessful, efforts at unionization for better conditions, but these were, again, generally unsuccessful, and we're going to have this continued transition into a industrial economy that has a growing wealth gap. Women often find work opportunities closed to them. Some young unmarried women could work in factories like the Lowell girls, but most were still essential to household income through the so-called putting out system, where the raw material of cotton, rather than being sent to a mill, might be sent to a private home where women would help to manufacture it in textiles and be paid a wage for doing that. Again, Republican motherhood and the cult of domesticity were the norm for women. Cult of domesticity idealized women's roles as wives and mothers, and Republican motherhood inherently assumed that women were inherently more moral than men, and that they should be held responsible for moralizing their families to be virtuous citizens of the republic. Now, among the emerging middle class, women were expected not to work at all, and hiring servants to do the housework would serve as a kind of badge of respectability. Men were expected to be in charge of household finances, and this all becomes ingrained in middle class culture, which is only beginning to really grow during this time. Finally, in terms of how it affected African Americans, and here I mean free African Americans, because those that were enslaved in the South, life gets much worse even than it already was. Um, but for free African Americans, they face discrimination and exclusion from jobs um, by nativists and immigrants. Uh, well, here, helping to reinforce the idea that African Americans were unhireable was the introduction of racial caricatures that could be used in blackface minstrel shows where a white person would paint themselves with like shoe polish or something, paint their faces black, and act in stereotypical racist characters that were meant to be African Americans, and any of those would portray African Americans as, unhireable in an industrial workforce. So one on the far left here is probably the best known is Jim Crow. Jim Crow is a carefree. He's carefree. He's childlike and he's stupid. Zip Coon, which is in the middle here. Zip Coon is a character that is irresponsible and who puts on airs by dressing and behaving in a way that is considered to be rising above his station, and that he's irresponsible with the money that he is paid. Finally, on the right, there is a character called Mr. Tambo, and this played on the stereotype of African Americans as being inherently musical, and that kind of pigeonholes them into the occupation of entertainment and very little beyond that. Um, Minstrel shows are employed oftentimes by Irish workers who are looking to distinguish themselves from free African Americans so that they are more likely to be hired. But minstrel shows become really the first uniquely American form of entertainment. It's not, this is the first time we've got entertainment forms that are not being imported from Europe, really. It's not, so these are an American invention. And really, the musical forms that they establish are going to be the basis for other uniquely American music later on, like jazz and rock and roll. Um, it's just unfortunate, though, that this comes from such a obviously racist depiction of African Americans. Finally, free African Americans could expect to find themselves barred from many schools and public facilities and responded by creating their own institutions, in particular, churches, which would become especially important in forming communities and later on for launching social action for abolition and equal rights.